Bear with me for a moment. I'm trying to make sure that the stream is actually live and going through and all that jazz. All the joys of trying to figure out if you're doing this right. But that's okay. I'm Professor Krebs, and today is the inaugural stream for Coding Corner. Now, in Coding Corner, I want to accomplish all sorts of goals. I want to make sure that students who are newer at Newmont, particularly where I teach, that those students have some supplemental material and they have some side projects that they can do in order to reinforce the learning that they're receiving, that they're gaining, that they're earning at school. But I also want to use this as an opportunity. Oh, that moment when I realize I'm not actually on camera. My desktop is on camera and I'm not. I also want to use this as an opportunity to explore other technologies and to learn new coding languages myself, and then we can explore those things together and have that experience. Now, hang tight while I just verify. Oh, look at that. Yeah. Go back. Awesome. Still getting set up here, so thank you for being patient and bearing with me. Do. Really want this to work. It says I'm live. I'd like to be able to see what's actually going on, and I'm trying really, really hard to see what's happening, and I can't, at least not on my mobile device here. Mobile life dashboard, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, I know. What are you going to do? You know? All right. So I love C Sharp, and it's my preferred language to develop in. I've got nothing against Java or Python, but you will hear me say some salty things about Java every once in a bit, especially when I'm talking about features in C Sharp that I think are superior. But just about every coding language out there that's used at the commercial level has value, obviously, or they wouldn't use it at the commercial level. And Java is one of them, and C Sharp is one of them, and C++ and all that. But I love developing in C Sharp. It is a language that takes into account the developer first and gives us, the developers, tons of tools to make our lives significantly easier and to make our jobs, to make us more efficient at our jobs. The language is feature rich and has all these tools, and I love this language. And so I decided that for the first episode of Coding Corner, we're going to use C Sharp. Now, if you haven't already, you can go over to YouTube where I have the Professor Krebs channel, and I've created the very first Coding Corner episode 0. This is all about setting up your environment so that you can code in C Sharp. This way you can get the IDE that you need, you can get the library that you need, and you can follow along. Also, it is my goal that once we're done with a coding corner, once we're done with a certain project or we get to a certain point, then I'm going to start uploading the code base to Git. And then I will give you the Git repository link, and you'll be able to pull that code down freely. So if you do miss anything and you don't have a chance to go back and see the videos, or maybe you went and saw the video and you tried to follow along, but something wasn't quite right on your end, or whatever the case may be, you can always go to the Git repo and you can get the code that I wrote so that you can run with that instead. I just realized, I brought some supplemental lighting with me, and I never turned it on, and so I'm just talking using the blue glow of the monitor to light my face. Anyway, so without further ado then, let's get right into the project itself. So if you have it already, go ahead and launch Visual Studio. If you don't have Visual Studio, go ahead and put this stream off to the side. Once again, go to the YouTube channel, check out this video, and get yourself set up so that we can code together. By the way, as we complete Coding Corner episodes, I will be adding those episodes to the Coding Corner playlist on YouTube. So check that out if that's something in which you are interested. Okay, so let's go ahead and bring up Visual Studio. Now, Visual Studio is my absolutely favorite C# IDE. It's made by Microsoft. It has all the bells and whistles you could ever want, and it even has some great features, like it has developer news from Microsoft right now. In case you didn't know, Microsoft is holding their annual online conference, and you can go to channel9.com and you can check out their conference for free. Everything's free there, and you can see what all the news is and what's coming out soon and all those things. So let's go to, now that we're in Visual Studio, I want to start a new project, and I've already created a folder for all my code to go into. If you haven't already, you might want to set up a folder. Don't worry, that part's next. If we go to File, you can go to New, and we can go to Project, and this will allow us to build any kind of .NET project that we want. Also, you will notice that there are hotkeys here. There's Control-Shift-N, and I love hotkeys. And so I'm probably going to use this most of the time. Also, down here, there is a Create New Project link. This is all in the YouTube video as well, by the way, but I wanted to kind of hit on this again. So, Control-Shift-N gives me the new project dialog. And depending on your installation of Visual Studio, you may have the same kind of projects that I do. You may have different projects. That's fine. What we care about today is we want to go to Visual C#. We want to go to Windows Universal, and we want to select Blank App Universal Windows. So years ago, the technology that you would use, let's back up a little bit more. The technology that we used to use to build Windows applications, you know, the kinds of things that have minimize buttons and maximize buttons and close, and it has a window and it has a graphical representation, that kind of interface we call a GUI, or a graphical user interface. And it used to be that if you wanted to build a GUI in C# or for Windows, you would use something called Windows Forms, or WinForms for short. Windows Forms was very easy to use, and in many ways it very much mirrored Java's Swing. Swing was their first go at GUI development in Java. And it was, you know, it was sufficient. It was easy to work with. WinForms was. Swing is a nightmare, by the way, and any Java developer will tell you that Swing is a nightmare. But WinForms was totally easy to get along with, and it was kind of, you had some drag and drop options. So you had WYSIWYG, what you see is what you get, and you had some WYSIWYG developer options. But as time went on, it was still kind of limited in what it could do reasonably well. And so then in the, I don't know, early to mid-2000s, I think it was about mid-2000s, they introduced WPF, which stands for Windows Platform Foundation. I'm sorry, Windows Presentation Foundation. And WPF, I've developed in WPF for almost a decade now, and it's fantastic. It has so many great features. It's not great for absolutely everything. For example, it doesn't handle 3D animations well. It doesn't... well, it is not great for games that are asynchronous games, or that are, you know, games like you would want to play on Xbox or anything like that. You wouldn't use WPF for that, because it is not a highly graphically driven or graphically optimized platform. It is meant to build Windows applications that you would use for, like, business, or for utilities for life, or, you know, things. So you have like a contact manager, or maybe you're managing your movie collection. Those kinds of things you would use WPF for. But you wouldn't use it for like high-end game development. They had something called XNA before, and that's since kind of gone the way of the dinosaur. Now we pretty much just lean on Unity and using C# for scripting and Unity for game development. But with the advent of Windows 8 and what they called the Metro aesthetic, and building Metro apps, and then moving to Windows 10 and building Windows 10 applications, as those things occurred and the operating system vastly changed from where it was with Windows Vista and so on, and Windows XP, WPF was sufficient. It was still compatible, but it was obvious that this was probably not where we wanted to stay forever. And they tried some things to change the way that GUIs were developed for Windows 10. And ultimately, they came up with something called Universal Windows Platform, so UWP. And the concept of UWP is that if I build it for any Windows device, even a laptop or a desktop, then once I'm done compiling, I can also put it onto the HoloLens, which is an augmented reality computing system, or I can put it on my Windows tablet or my Windows phone if I happen to still have something like that. Or I can put it on Xbox if it's Xbox, if it makes sense to put it on that platform. In other words, I build it once, I compile it, and now I can distribute it across multiple platforms that run the Windows operating system. So we are going to build a UWP application for the game Lights Out. Now, I know that I said that WPF and UWP are not great for games, but once you see how this game functions, you'll realize that doesn't really apply in this case. Lights Out is a great game for UWP and WPF. All right, so we're going to make a blank app for the Universal Windows applications, and we want to choose the location for where we want to store our code. I typically will build a folder for holding specific projects of a certain type. I've used the default location before, obviously, because I've got a few projects in here, but I have purposely set aside a folder for these episodes, for these streams that we are working on together, and I'm going to use this area to store all of my projects for my Twitch stream. So let's go ahead and select that folder. Notice that we're just selecting the folder. We're not actually naming the application yet. We will do that right here. So let's call this Lights Out. Nice and easy peasy, right? Okay, so go ahead and click OK. And when you do that, it's going to ask you what target version and minimum version, and you may have different numbers here than I do, which is perfectly acceptable. In the course of installing certain packages and certain libraries, I have been left with build versions or build numbers 16299 and build 17134. Now 17134 is more current, but because my laptop is my work laptop and the way that updates for Windows works at my place of employment, this does not really work well for me because even though I can build the application using this level, my designer will not, my preview will not work correctly. Don't worry, you'll see that in a moment. But go ahead and choose whichever in the target version, just choose whatever build number you have. And if you have multiple, pick the highest one. If you have a problem, then we can always address that separately and we can see what we can do about fixing that. So I'm going to go ahead and pick 16299 because I know that works for me. And it's going to take a moment. It's going to build the project in its default state. So it's going to add things like libraries, and it's going to add references, and it's going to add a default starting page and things of that nature. So we are going to finish letting that build. And once we do, then you're going to see that there is this startup page. You'll get this every time you build a new Universal Windows Platform or UWP application. And these links are just educational links. These are things you can click on and you can read the information about, what is UWP app and how do I get Windows 10 samples and where's the documentation so I can learn more about this technology, because real developers, they use documentation. Absolutely true. So we don't need this today. We're going to go ahead and close that off. And let's open up Solution Explorer. Now, in your case, Solution Explorer may already be open. I have mine unpinned so that it hides itself when I'm not actively interacting with it. That way I free up real estate in the body of the development environment. You should have something that looks like this. You've got an app this says XAML, but it's actually pronounced XAML. It is not, and I gotta be clear about this, okay? It is not camel, it is not examl, it is not XAML, it is not shazaml. It is pronounced XAML, and the reason I'm hitting that so hard is because Microsoft has made it very clear for about 10 years now that XAML is pronounced XAML. So just so you're aware, if you're talking to another C# developer or someone who's developing for Windows, you don't want to ever call it XML or Shazaml or Camel. And by the way, these are all names I've heard before in the course of teaching. You want to make sure that you say XAML. So we've got this app.xaml, and this is really, if you double click on that, this will open up the app.xaml file, which is just some XML that describes our application, and we can set up certain configuration elements in here. We don't need to right now, so we're not going to worry about this. But I just wanted to explain what it was. There's also this, I gotta be honest with you, this lights out temporary key thing, I'm not really certain what this is for. I think this may have to do with running applications safely in a Windows 10 environment, but I'm not entirely certain, and that's something that I need to research and then I can give you a better answer on. And then the package manifest, this is metadata that gets included every time you build your project and it builds a new executable. This is the metadata that gets assigned to that executable to include things like what rotations do you support, and when you go to visual assets, you'll see things for like what size icon are you going to be using, and because there are different places where different size icons get used and so on. All the information about the application once it is built and ready to execute is stored in the manifest. Again, that's not something we need to change right now, so we're going to skip that. Let's go to mainpage.xaml. Now, before we can open this up, but you'll notice that there's an expansion arrow on the left. If we expand this arrow, then you'll see that there's mainpage.xaml and mainpage.xaml.cs. First, let's start with just .xaml. And when this opens up, you've got the preview. This is what we call the designer. And this will give you a preview of what your UI looks like based on the set dimensions here and what elements you have tossed in and measurements and things of that nature. And then down here, you've got XML-like syntax that declaratively creates this UI. Now, me personally, I don't like this horizontal split, so I'm going to go ahead and grab a vertical. I'm going to hit that button. If you missed it, let me do that one more time. There are 3 buttons here. There's this sort of a collapse pane, which will close the lower pane down, and that can be kind of a pain, so don't click that right now. Yeah, that can be kind of a frustration. Horizontal split is what we're in right now. This is the vertical split button. So when I click that button, it creates a vertical split in my development UI. I also like to grab the median here and crush this down a bit because I don't need the designer to be super huge in this case, and I can go ahead and zoom out a little bit more. And I can see what I need to while developing. Hopefully this is readable on your screen. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit so that the font's a little easier to read. If you find that this is hard to read while we're going through this and you want to let me know that this isn't big enough or it's hard to read, let me know, and then I'll go ahead and zoom in a little bit more. Okay, so in UWP there is this notion of layout elements versus content elements. And layout elements are exactly what you think they are. They let you position things, put them on the screen where you want them, especially in relationship to each other. And there are 5 major layout elements that we can use. Right now, by default, you have the grid. And the grid is great. It allows us to make rows and columns, and every cell is equal to every other cell. By default, and we can change that. There are some things we can tweak to make cells different sizes and so on. The grid is great in general, but there are some other layout elements that might be better for what we want ultimately in the end. For example, for today, we're not going to be able to finish all of Lights Out in one go, and so I would like to take a moment and kind of show some proofs of concept. I want to be able to demonstrate how this is going to function ultimately in the end, and also teach you a little bit about how we wire things up. So first, let's just get some things in the UI. They don't have to do anything. Let's just make things appear so that we know that we can put things on the screen. Let's get at least that far. So right now we have a grid, and that's fine. Actually, hang on a second. I'm trying to... Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay, so I'm using some hotkeys in my OBS broadcasting software to transition between 2 different perspectives, but those hotkeys are also mapped in Visual Studio, and so if I hit those hotkeys, then I'm impacting what's happening in Visual Studio, and that's a little frustrating, but that's okay. I just need to map different hotkeys, right? All right, cool. So let's go back over here. Let's see. Yeah, we want to do that one, and there we go. Sorry, without my hotkey, life's a little difficult. All right, so we have a grid, and we'll come back to using a grid in just a moment. For right now, let's go ahead and let's add a stack panel. And what I like about stack panels is that as I add elements into a stack panel, like let's give it a rectangle with a width of, let's do like 500, and let's do a height of 250. And then let's give it a fill. That's how you give a rectangle color on the inside of its body. Let's do like blue. I love blue. That's a good color. And then let's go ahead and close that tag. You'll notice that when I started writing rectangle, I actually started with an open angle bracket because this is all XML, which is all markup. And because this is all markup, we need to have open tags and close tags. You'll see that the stack panel has an open tag and a close tag as symbolized by the /. And some tags like rectangle you can do as a self-closing tag. And when we do that, you'll see that this little blue rectangle appears at the top of our screen. And just so that you know, for readability, I list these attributes vertically, but you don't have to. They can actually be on the same line together if that is rather, if that's what you prefer. And if I have them on the same line, I can use a hotkey, Control C. Control C, if nothing is highlighted, right now I've got this highlighted, that's great, but if I put my cursor here and I hit Control C, I copy the whole line with a line break. And if I come down to the next line and I hit Control V with nothing highlighted, I will insert that line with a line break. It's one of my favorite features of Visual Studio. And it seems very simple, but when you're a developer and you're doing this all the time, really simple features like that make your life so much easier. So without anything highlighted, Control C, Control X will copy and cut that line, and then with your cursor on the next line or wherever you want it to be, if you hit Control V with nothing highlighted, then it will insert that line you just copied or cut, and it will bump everything else down. Okay, cool. So we have two rectangles here, and right now they're just forming one giant rectangle. If I hover over it in the designer, you'll see that there are two different rectangles. Let's go ahead and make this one like something really hideous to look at. Let's make this like orange or something. And yes, there are Broncos fans out there who are like, what do you mean blue and orange is hideous? But that's another conversation for another day. So here are two rectangles, and they're slammed right up against each other. The reason I put these two in here like this is because I wanted to show you that with the stack panel, it puts its children, these child elements, these rectangles, into the stack panel vertically, top to bottom. And if I, just so that you're aware, if I wanted a different flow, if I didn't want to go top to bottom, but I wanted to go left to right, I could always make this a horizontal stack panel. And it's by its nature, it's giving the objects as much space as they need, in this case, horizontally, because it's trying to preserve that horizontal space because that's the flow, but it doesn't care how much space it takes up vertically. If I didn't give this rectangle, if I didn't give blue a height, if I just got rid of that for a second, you'll see that the rectangle automatically fills the entire vertical space. But if I change this back to vertical, now vertical space is at a premium. And because vertical space is at a premium, what happened to the blue rectangle? Well, because vertical space is at a premium and the rectangle does not specify a height, the stack panel says, oh, I'm going to give you as much vertical space as you need. How much vertical space do you need? You don't have a height? Great. Then the vertical space you need is 0. And so then the rectangle is still there. It's got width, but it has no height. So if we want to fix that, if we want to make sure that we've got that we have the right height, then we want to set that explicitly like we did before. I'm just going to back up. I'm just Control Z to back this up. Okay, cool. So now we've got these two rectangles, and they're slammed up against each other, and that's no fun. So you know what? On this blue one, I'm going to add a margin. And if you've ever done any web development or if you've ever done any UI design, then you know that margin is the space around the outside of an object. In fact, there are two things you might see a lot of. You might see margin, you might see padding. And they do something kind of similar. If you only use one, then they do something that's kind of similar. And you might ask, well, what's the difference between margin and padding? And I thought about this just today, actually. Think about the terms roof and ceiling. What's the difference between roof and ceiling? They're both over our heads and they keep the weather out, right? But what's the difference between a roof and a ceiling? A roof is on the outside of a building. Ceiling is on the inside of the building, right? The ceiling is what's above me right now, immediately above me, and the roof is outside of that. Well, margin and padding are very much the same thing. Margin is on the outside of the element, whereas padding is on the inside of the element. So, I've added a margin attribute to the blue rectangle, and in that margin, we have, it wants us to put in up to 4 values. And those 4 values are left, top, right, bottom. If you use 4 numbers, that's what it means. So it starts on the left side and moves clockwise to the top, right, and bottom. Or you can reduce it to 2 numbers. And that means that the margin is the left-right value. And this one over here is the top-bottom value. Or if you want the margin to be uniform all the way around the object, then you can simply just have one number. And so if I put 20, oh, not 200, that's a lot. If I put 20 here, you'll see that there's a little bit of a space between the top and the bottom of the designer window here and between the blue and orange rectangle. And if we had objects on the left and the right of this blue rectangle, you would see that difference. You would see how they really aren't touching each other anymore. So I'm just going to put margin on both of these. I'll put a margin of 20 on each just to kind of give them a little bit of space. That's awesome. Okay, cool. Now, finally, in the stack panel, I'm going to add a button. Buttons give us a way to interact, give the users a way to interact with our application. So let's give this a button. And this is going to make sense in just a little bit. But I'm going to give my button a name. I'm going to say name equals, and let's call this, let's just say activate. Really kind of the activate button. And that's kind of silly and all, but I'm going to give it a value. Well, I'm going to give it a content. This is the label inside the button. I'm going to give it a, in fact, actually, before I do that, let me just close this tag. Let me do a self-closing tag. And the button is not visible yet because it doesn't need to display anything. There's no content. But if I add the content of activate, now you will see that there is this button. I'm kind of zoomed out in my designer. So let's see. Where's my zoom at? In fact, I thought there was normally a zoom control. Let's change this to like 20. Yeah, that's good. And you'll see that there's a button over here on the side. It's really, really tiny. It's like ridiculously small. And it's just over here on the left-hand side. We can fix that by just saying, hey, the font size of this button is going to be one of my favorite number of all time, 24. And still that's not big enough. Okay, fine. 42. That is the answer to everything, right? Oh, look, it's beautiful now. And you may also notice that in this case, the button is slammed all the way to the left, right? And that's kind of interesting. Okay, fine. If you do horizontal content alignment, actually, I think this one we want, excuse me, I think we actually want horizontal alignment. So let's do horizontal alignment, and let's do center. And you'll notice that I'm not typing very much when I enter these things in. That's because as you type in Visual Studio, you will have something called Intellisense. And Intellisense allows the IDE, Visual Studio, to guess what your next thing is going to be. Based on what you've typed, what is it that Visual Studio thinks you might want to do? When I started typing in horizontal, I typed in HORI, and it gave me everything containing HORI as a sequence of characters. And in this case, I chose horizontal alignment, and I chose center. When I hit C, it gave me the first option, and I hit Tab, and it auto-filled for me. You're going to see that happen a lot. It's one of the ways that I type so fast in Visual Studio. The secret is I don't type everything. I let Visual Studio type for me when it makes sense. So now we've got this button in there, and it's pretty close to these guys. You know what? Let's give the button a margin also. Let's give it a margin, but in this case, let's make sure that the margin is only on top. You remember that when we have 4 values like this, we're applying margins to all 4 sides, but those values can be different. I could make this one 10, and this one, you know, I could leave that one 0 if I wanted to. I could make this one 50. I can make this one, I could even do weird numbers like 13 if I wanted to. And they can all have different margins. But typically in UI, we tend to have at least some uniformity in our margins. But in this case, I only want to apply the margin to one side of the element. And remember, this one is left, right? This is the left side, which means if we move clockwise, this is the margin that is on top of the button. So let's go ahead and put like a 40, not 400, 40. Let's put, 40 is not enough. Let's make this 100. That's better. I like that a little bit better. Now, there are other layout elements. I could do like a relative panel, and that would help let me space things out relative to each other. But stack panels are really easy to work with, and for what we need to do today, this is perfectly fine. Okay, now I'm going to back up a step, and by the way, since this, just so that we have this clear, since this is a live coding demonstration, I'm not perfect. I'm going to get some things wrong. And if I get stuff wrong and you catch it, that is awesome, because then you can tell me in the chat that I've screwed something up. But mostly, what I'm trying to say is I'm going to get some things wrong. And when I do, that's fine. Because in computer science, being wrong teaches you so much more than just being right all the time. So I have no fear of being wrong. I just want to let you know in advance, I'm probably going to screw some things up. And you know what? That's okay. All right, so my button has a name. And I know that when I click this button, I want to be able to take certain actions. In fact, I want to start like playing around with the colors of these rectangles. And so I'm going to give each rectangle a name also. And I'll explain what the purpose is for this in just a moment. But let's call this, I don't want to call it blue rectangle because we're going to change the color. Let's just call this rect1 with a capital R, so rect1. And then down here, let's call this, of course, rect2. I was going to be silly and name it like Bob or something, but nah, we won't do that today. So rect1, rect2. So we've got two rectangles and we've got a button. Great. Now in UWP, remember earlier we had this main page.xaml, and now down here you'll see main page.xaml.cs. The reason that these are the same names is because while this part holds the markup that describes what the visuals should look like, this file, if you double click it, is all of the actual code. It's what we call the code behind. We will put logical statements inside of this class, and we will add visual elements inside of this document. And this page represents the visuals, this page represents the logic. What I really like about this, and it takes a moment to kind of appreciate, but what I really like about this is that this is a carryover from WPF. And the reason that Microsoft did this, the reason they put the markup, the description of how things should look in one document and then had a related document for how it should behave, was so that we could separate the need for engineers to understand UI UX and for UI designers to have to understand back-end gears and grease. Because as luck would have it, or rather I shouldn't say luck, as nature would have it, people who are really good engineers tend to be really bad at UI UX. They tend to be really bad at designing interfaces for users, right? And on the flip side, people who are extremely artistic and who understand how the psychology of humans work, as far as like when they use an application, where do they look and what's intuitive, and UI UX designers, people who are really good at that, are not necessarily as strong at the engineering side. And that's something that we've seen since the dawn of computer programming. And so Microsoft separated these two things, and they said, okay, fine, let's let our engineers do what they do best, engineer, and let's let our UI designers do what they do best and design the way that this thing looks and is able to be interacted with. And so when you look at WPF and UWP, you will always see a markup document like this. Here's a markup document, and then here's your code behind. Okay, so the reason I showed you that is because we are going to, right now if we launch this, if I hit Control F5 lets me run the application without going into debug mode. So if I hit Control F5, it'll take a moment and it will build down here. You'll see it says ready, give it a moment to breathe, and then it says deploy started. And really what it's doing is it's compiling the code and making it so that it will run on our system. And you'll see that as I hover over activate, it does highlight like a button would, because it is a button. And rectangle doesn't do anything. I can click on these things and nothing happens. And I can click on activate, and you can even see that activate is pressing. It's actually clicking, but nothing's happening. So why is nothing happening? Well, we have a button there, that's true, but have we actually said what the button should do? What action it should take? No. So it is clickable, but it hasn't been told to do anything. So we are going to tell our button what to do. And there are a few different ways to do this. What I want to show you first is as I start to fill this in, you'll see that Intellisense jumps in, and you'll see symbols like a wrench and a lightning bolt, and even some like curly braces and things of that nature. The wrench is a property. It is some setting of the button. For example, let's look at content. We used that earlier, right? Content allows us to indicate what should be inside here. And content doesn't have to be a string. Content could be a picture, or it could be a GIF, or this is where it gets kind of funny. The content of a button could be another element, like say a grid or a stack panel, or even another button if you really wanted to mess with people. You can put anything you want in content, and the button will show it, and the button will retain its button qualities, like the ability to be clicked. So wrenches are properties. They are settings of that object that you can change or that you can get so that you can analyze it. But then these lightning bolts. These lightning bolts are referred to as events. This is an event. In other words, some action takes place, and when that action takes place, we want the code to jump in and then do some consequence, create some consequence. And so the event is when this button is clicked, do something, right? That's what this event represents. It represents when the button gets clicked. So let's go ahead and select click and hit enter. And so this is our event. It's saying, okay, when the event fires, what method should it call? And a method is going to be a function. It's going to be a collection of code that executes every time that function is called. Now, by default, I can just go ahead and say, hey, let's do a new event handler, and I can hit enter. And when I do that, it'll give it a default name based on the name of the button, or the name of the name of the button itself in this case, and the name of the event. And so that's where we get activate button underscore click. But what's really cool is that when it created this automatic name, it also went to the code behind. See these asterisks? These asterisks indicate that the file has not yet been saved, but changes have been made. Well, when we did this, the code behind changed. And if you click on the code behind, here is the method that will execute every time that button is clicked. So let's do something really simple first. What I want to do is I'm about to put myself in a weird place. I want to show a box. I want to show a message on the screen that informs us that the button has been clicked. But in UWP, that's not as simple as it was in WPF. In WPF, it was the case that you had this object called a message box, and you could just tell it to show, and it would pop up on the screen. But UWP is built for all Windows platforms, including mobile devices. And so when we're building these applications, it has to take into account the idea that at any moment the app could be put to sleep. It could then be called back up to attention, and anything that it's doing might have to be put on pause. And so every interaction behind the scenes with UWP is going to be what we call asynchronous. It's going to be its own little process, its own little thread. And in so doing, showing a message box on the screen actually became a bit more complicated. It became complicated enough that I'm going to have to actually look up just some code that I've written previously just to make this go a little bit faster. So I'm going to hop over to a demo of mine, and I'm purposely not showing this on the screen because I don't want to accidentally show anything that's proprietary to my work. But let me just hop over here to this demo that I've written before, and we will do, let's see, I want to say it is UWP, that's a test. Let's do an event demo, maybe that'll show us what we need. I'm going to open that up really quick. My apologies, I should have had this piece of code ready, and I totally forgot that in UWP this part's a little trickier than I would like it to be. But let's see. This is not what I want. Okay. So let me find the code that works. In fact, maybe you should race me. If you go onto Google and you say message box UWP, I bet you'll find exactly what we need. In fact, you know what? That's what I'm going to do next anyway. So let me go ahead and pop open the Googles. And I'll go ahead and show you what I'm doing here. And so let's do UWP show message box. And you can see this is purple because I've gone to this link before. And so when we hop in here, Stack Overflow says, oh yeah, it's because what you really need is a message dialog, and you're going to have to show it in an asynchronous way. And so yes, I'm going to be cheap, and I'm just going to copy this code because that's what it's there for. So let's come back over here, and then back inside of our method, let's go ahead and paste that code that we just got. Now, if we're going to use this await keyword, we also have to add the async keyword to our method declaration, or it doesn't work. Also, you'll see that message dialog is in an error state, and that's because this class belongs to a library that we are not yet using in our code. And so we have to add that using. The fastest way to do that is with your cursor blinking on the word that's having trouble, on the red stuff. You can do control dot, and that will open up a suggestion window for how to fix the problem. And in this case, we want windows.ui.popups. So go ahead and select that. And when we've done that, you'll see that we get this Windows UI popups into our usings. And this is no longer underlined in red, and it's green to indicate that it is a type in C#. All right, cool. So we've got this message dialog, and we want to put our message here. Great. Let's just say activate was clicked, and we're going to say it with an exclamation because we are enthusiastic about this, right? Now, you'll notice that I as a reflex, I already went ahead and saved this code, but you'll notice that our markup is still in an edited but not saved state. If you want to save everything that you have changed, and you should get in the habit of doing this, if you want to save everything that you've changed, Control-Shift-S. Control-Shift-S will save everything that you have open in the project. Okay, so let's go ahead and hit Control F5 again. And this time, oh, I just realized I have that open. I don't need it open. This time, when our application opens, I can click on the rectangles and nothing happens. Click on the rectangle, nothing happens. But when I click Activate, I get this message box that says Activate was clicked. And if I hit the Tab key, you'll notice that my Activate button is currently, it has this border on it for focus. If you hit the Tab key, your focus will jump to the Activate. And if you hit like the space bar, that'll click your button. If you hit Enter, that'll click your button. And if you're in a touchscreen environment, you can touch the button on the screen, and that will activate the button as well. Okay, so let's go and close that off. So now we know that we can put things on the screen, and we can make buttons that are clickable, and they actually do things. Okay, that's great. Not a problem. Let's see. What would be useful at this point? Well, at this point, let's play around with changing the colors of rectangles. So let's go to our code behind. And let's see, what might be the best way to do this? You know what? Let's keep it nice and simple. Let's keep it super simple. Let's go ahead and create two solid, actually, hang on a second. This is a matter of best practice. Let's make a private solid color brush. A solid color brush, the reason it's called a brush is because it will paint that color, or if it's an image brush, it'll paint that image, or if it's a gradient brush, it'll paint that gradient onto the screen. And brushes are used throughout UI development to give objects background colors, or to give borders colors, or to put an image in the background, or whatever the case may be. We use brushes in various ways. All for putting some visual or some aesthetic adjustment onto the screen. So we want to create a solid color brush. Just it's a solid color. There's no shading to it, and it can be any one of the millions of colors that we can make with the 4 ARGB values. So we're gonna make a solid color brush, and let's be really simple about this. And let's just make this the blue brush. Okay, and we're going to set this equal to a new solid color brush. And when we make a new solid color brush, we have to give it a color. And we can either indicate what the color is in hexadecimal, or we can get a little cheap and we can use some predefined colors. So we're going to type in with a capital C the word colors, plural. And at first, autofill is going to want to fill it up with the wrong stuff. Hit the escape key. Hit the escape key to get rid of that autofill, and hit dot. And then type in blue. Now, the reason this doesn't look like it's working, let's put a semicolon at the end. The reason this doesn't look like it's working is because colors is a static class that is not currently in scope. It's not currently visible because we don't have the right usings. It's the exact same problem we had with message dialog. How did we fix that last time? We did control dot. With our cursor on colors, we did control dot. And it's going to give us suggestions on what we can use. The first one is usually the right answer, which is kind of wonderful about Visual Studio. We want windows.ui. So let's go ahead and select that. And it's going to add another using. Here's windows.ui. It added another using alphabetically to our list, which makes me very happy as a sort of a compulsive person, an obsessively compulsive person. I like that they do this alphabetically. It makes me happy. So let's go ahead and grab this blue brush, and let's do our little trick from earlier without anything highlighted, but with our cursor on the line. Let's do Control-C, Control-V. And now we have two of the exact same thing. Let's change the second one from blue brush to orange brush, and from colors.blue to colors.orange. And we're going to need some way to track the state of our application. I want us to create this notion that there is a flipped state. Either we're in a flipped state, so we're in the opposite mode, or we're not in a flipped state. It's almost like daylight savings time, except none of this ever applies to anyone in Arizona, right? So with daylight savings, you have standard time and you have daylight time, and you're either in one mode or you're in the other. So in programming, whenever we're in one way or we're in another way, we're never both, we're never neither. In other words, there's only two possibilities in the universe. What kind of data type do we use for that? We use, oh, yeah, there I go using my hotkeys again, freaking out Visual Studio. We use a Boolean. And in C#, it's not Boolean unless it's a capital B and you're trying to talk to the class version. If you want the primitive, it's just bool. And let's just call this is flipped. And we're going to start in the false position. In other words, when it's false, it means we're in the default state. Top rectangle is blue, bottom rectangle is orange. And when we're in the flipped state, those colors will be in the opposite positions. So I don't want to necessarily lose this code because it's kind of a pain to go look up every time I want it. But if you highlight it and hit Control KC, it will comment out the code. Hit the right arrow key so that you unhighlight and then hit enter. I often hit enter first, then it erases my code on accident. Okay, cool. So now when the button gets clicked, the first thing we want to do is we want to flip the is flipped state. And one of the things I love about Booleans is I can say is flipped equals the opposite or not is flipped. And now it goes from false to true or from true to false. Please pardon the sound. I have a bottle of water and I am thirsty. So we're going to flip is flipped. We're going to change is flipped to its opposite state, right? So in other words, we're going to start in false, and when I click the button, the first thing that's going to happen is that is flipped is going to move from false to true, because not false is true, right? So we're going to make it true, and then once it's true, we can now say if well, let's see. Yeah, let's not get too flashy here. If we're going to say if is flipped, in other words, if is flipped is true, then we're going to say rect1.fill equals if it's true, we want to flip, so we want it to be the orange brush. And rect2, we want the fill to be the blue brush. Otherwise, in other words, if we discover that is flipped is actually false, if we've clicked the button and it has turned is flipped to false, then we want to do the exact same thing here, except that we want it to be the normal colors. We want it to be the starting colors. So blue brush on rect1, and we want the fill on rect2 to be the orange brush. Okay, so nice and simple, easy peasy. Let's go ahead and let's run the application with Control F5. So I clicked Control F5, it's going to build, it's going to deploy, and then it will pop up on the screen in just a moment. See, right now it's telling me that the build succeeded and everything's okay. I think that might be because I saved. Let me hit Control F5 one more time. There we go. So let's click Activate, and sure enough, those rectangles swap colors. That's awesome, right? Hey, fun fact, along the way here, I'm going to show you some best practices and some tips and tricks and things of that nature, right? So right now, we have this, if is flipped, blah, blah, blah. We could actually express this exact same thing as two ternaries. Ternaries are true-false statements that result in some consequence, right? So they're like they're simplified. They are simplified if-elses. Now in this case, we're assigning two different values. So if we want to do this in a ternary, we'd have to do this as two separate ternaries, and that's okay. Just to give you an idea, I'm going to go ahead and comment this out and write this as a ternary so that you can see it in action. So we can just say rect1.fill equals, and instead of assigning a brush, first we're going to do a Boolean check. So I'm going to type in is flipped. And really what that's saying is check is flipped to see if it's true or false. If I follow it then with a question mark, I'm asking if it's true or if it's false. And if it's true, I want it to be the orange brush. But if it's, I'm sorry, I put a semicolon there as a reflex. If we put a colon there, that is the else. That is the if it's false, right? So check is flipped, and if it's true, use orange brush. Otherwise, use the blue brush. And if I do the exact same thing again, I can change this to rect2, and if I really wanted to, I could flip this to not. I could say, hey, if is flipped is false, I want you to start with the orange brush. Otherwise, if we are flipped, go to blue. So these two lines of code do the exact same thing as these, what, 12 lines of code? Is that what I'm seeing? 10 lines of code. 10 lines of code. So let's try that again. Let's make sure that the changes let's make sure that I'm right, because I'm wrong about stuff. Let's make sure that I'm right. Oh, look at that. It's not working. It's not working. Why isn't it working? Okay, well, let's go back here and let's check this out. So let's see. Oh, you know why? Because I accidentally commented my Boolean, the part that actually flips the Boolean, I commented that out so it would never actually flip the Boolean. Let's try that again. Simple error, no big deal. Yeah, and look at that, the colors are changing. So I'm going to, let's see, I'm going to grab this right here, and using Alt arrow down, I'm going to move it because, you know, one could argue very reasonably that this code here is more reasonable and readable. In other words, it's easier for a human to look at this and understand what it's saying. Others will argue, very reasonably, that this is more concise, and that it's not that hard to follow if you know what a ternary is. In fact, if I wanted to make sure that it was not hard for someone to understand at first glance, I would be a good sport, and I would just, you know, swap these positions so that we're making the same kind of comparison, we're making the same kind of check, and we result in the same relative outcome. All right, so now, you know, if you know what a ternary is, this is not that hard to read, and it's extremely concise. I do love me some ternaries. So I'm going to go ahead and leave this alone, but I will also leave this here so that you can see what the standard if-else would look like. Okay, great. So now when we click the button, the rectangles change colors. Awesome. Now, how can we take what we know? How can we take what we've learned so far and then apply this to where we're trying to get? Remember that what we're trying to do is we're trying to build the lights out game. And I don't know if you saw my previous stream, but I'm going to go ahead and just bring up what Google shows when you search lights out. There was this game in, I guess it was the mid-90s, and it would present to you puzzles where certain lights were turned on and the other lights were turned off. All the purple buttons are not illuminated, they're all turned off, and the pink ones are turned on. And the goal was to turn off every light on the screen so that all of them were out, right? And I showed this image previously as well. The way it works is whenever you touch a button, whether it is on or off, it flips its state to the opposite state, and it flips the state of its top, left, right, and bottom neighbors. So, for example, right now in this picture, you'll see that this middle button is off, but top, left, right, and bottom are on. If I were to click that button, the middle button would turn on, and these four buttons would turn off. We want to take that behavior and we want to apply it to our application in our Visual Studio project, right? And so let's consider this for a second. If we can set up an example where clicking a rectangle will change its own information. It's not that hard to take it a next step further and say, okay, well, when I click this rectangle, I want to modify the one on top, right? And then vice versa. So let's see. How can we do this? How can we do this? Well, let's get a little smart about this. Let's say, what would make the most sense? First, let's prove that we can kind of attach some function to these guys. Because if you try to do a click event on a rectangle, you'll find out very quickly rectangles can't be clicked. They don't have a click function. But they are a visual element. And remember that we're building an application that should be able to be used in any environment, including a touch environment. And so there is this notion of, I think it's called tapped. Yeah, there's this event called tapped. And there is there's a double tap, and there is a right tap, because they have this idea that tapped is just a left click of a mouse, or it is a single brief press with a finger on a touch screen. Right tapped is a right click on a mouse, or it is a long press on a touch screen. And then double tapped is exactly what it sounds like. It sounds like the correct rule in Zombieland. No, double tapped means I double clicked it with the left button, or I double tapped it with my finger in a touch environment. All right, fine. So we want regular tapped, right? We want regular tapped. So we're going to go ahead and say yes tapped. And here, this is for the blue rectangle. So when I click the blue rectangle, I want to turn the bottom rectangle blue as well. In other words, I'm kind of like clicking the blue rectangle to make the other rectangle conform. So let's do a new event handler. I'm just going to take the default name. So this is going to be rect1 tapped, right? And that way we know which rectangle was tapped. I'm going to hop back over here, and I'm going to define what this means. And I'm going to keep it super simple just to prove that it works. So let's do rect2.fill equals, and you know what? I'll tell you what. How about we make it so that when we click the top rectangle, it makes the bottom rectangle the same color. Now, when we click activate, the rectangles are not always the same color, right? When I click activate, sometimes the top one is blue, sometimes the top one is orange. So we're just going to borrow rectangle 1's fill brush, and we're just going to say, yeah, rectangle 2 match rectangle 1. And we're going to do exactly the same concept for the orange rectangle. Let's add a tapped function to that. By the way, purely for terms of organization, I'm going to cut that out, and I'm going to move this after all of the visual stuff, because I tend to put the name first, followed by the visuals, followed by the events. So I'm going to, at the end of rectangle orange here, I'm going to type in, or rect2, I'm going to do tapped. Oh, excuse me. Excuse me. Oh, so sorry. And we're going to do a new event handler. We'll do rect2 tapped. Yes, there is a more elegant way to handle this, but I'm keeping this super simple so that you can just see the principles at work. Okay. So let's do rect1 fill. So we want to change the first rectangle's fill to match the second rectangle's fill. Awesome. Let's go ahead and execute this and see what happens. So right now I can, hit the activate button. Everything works the way it should. When I click rect1, see how rect2 is now the same color? And if I click rect2, it doesn't look like anything's happening, but something is happening. Remember that we've designed this so that whenever I click one rectangle, it makes the other rectangle the same color. Well, they're both blue, so it doesn't matter which rectangle I click. It is going through the process. It's going through the event, but they're both the same color. And since they're both the same color, you're going to get the same result. Nothing's going to change. So let's click activate so they switch colors. Now the top one's orange and the bottom one's blue. If I click the top one, yeah, look at that. Let's do it again. Let's just click the bottom rectangle, and you'll see the top one conforms. So now we've proven that our events work irrespective of what color the original rectangles are. It'll work in every case. That's what we want. We always want to prove that what we are doing works. And so we're going to make some minor changes, and then we'll test a little bit. We'll change a little bit. We'll test a little bit. Like you saw earlier, I made a really simple mistake, and if I hadn't tested at that point, it would have been really hard to figure out where that problem was coming from, right? All right, cool. So now we know that we can click a button, we can click rectangles, and we can have some effect. All right. before today's coding corner is over, let's actually build a grid. Let's go ahead and add a grid. And you know what? For right now, let's do everything in the markup. We could make this smart, and we could say, hey, let's do let's make it so the grid can be any size we want and things like that. We can get to that later. But for right now, let's make it conform to the standard game. And the standard game is a 5x5 grid. Perfect. All right, not a problem. So all this stuff here, if you don't want to lose this, if you want to keep this around for notes and things, that's perfectly fine. Go ahead and just comment this out by highlighting it and then hit Control KC. And so I've commented all this out, and that means that everything over here is going to be broken. So I'm going to go ahead and comment out this code as well, so that we don't have any issues with the code we're about to write. Awesome. Okay, also, fun fact, in Visual Studio, they give you this really cool ability to create something called a region. And a region is an area of code that is collapsible. So we're going to call this old events, old event handlers. That's really what they are. And then at the end, wherever you want that region to stop, you're going to type in hashtag end region. By the way, the technical term is octothorpe, and I hate saying hashtag, but that's okay. So here's region, and let's go ahead and hit minus. If you hit that minus, it collapses all that old code down, so we don't have to look at it. And regions can also exist inside of methods, not just outside of methods. So we can do a region here, and we'll just say old demo code. And then at the bottom of that, do an end region. And now we can collapse this demo code down. So now we've gotten rid of a lot of visual cruft, a lot of visual noise, right? And remember, both these files are in a state of not saved, even though they've been edited. So I'm going to do Control-Shift-S and save everything. So now we're in a state where we can easily... Oh, I just caught that. I just caught that. Yeah, fun fact. Let's go ahead and take this and move it above here. Bam. There we go. I'm going to bump that down. Now, when you make a region and when you collapse a region, you're not actually deleting the code and you're not commenting out the code. The code is still there and the code is still live. It's just invisible. So you can't really see it. Right now we have a method that doesn't ever get used. That's fine by me. I don't really care so much. And then we have some other methods that have been commented out. Also not a problem. It occurs to me that we don't really need this old demo code stuff. I misinterpreted where I was in the code. So that's okay. We'll get rid of that region. And now everything is inside of this old event handlers thing. I'm also going to take a moment and just comment out this button handler. There we go. And we'll just collapse this. Great. Remember, Control-KC to comment. It's Control-KU to uncomment. All right, sweet. So we've got the blue and orange brush and all that stuff. Let's decide right now what we want our colors to be. In fact, you know what? If we're going to build lights out, let's stick with this sort of like it's kind of like a gray indigo. And then we have this like bright freaking magenta. Yeah. So here is a tip. Go over to color.adobe. And if you go to color.adobe.com, it brings up a color wheel and you can create any color palette you want. This is one of my favorite tools, especially when I'm doing UI design. And let's make sure that we get the colors that we want. So the color of the off button or of the off light is something like, let's see, it's kind of over here. Oh yeah, look at this color right here. That's the color we want. I like that. And this color, you can change the saturation level, you can change its hue, you can do all sorts of cool things. But down here, it gives you the red, green, blue value, or in just raw numbers, but you can also get it in hexadecimal. So I've highlighted, it's hard to see, but I've highlighted the hexadecimal. I'm going to go ahead and copy that. And let's hop back over to our Visual Studio project. And instead of blue brush, let's call this the on brush. Okay, so this is the on brush. And instead of colors, let's make a new color. Sorry, I cased that wrong. Let's do a new color. And when you make a new color, let's see, I want to say, oh, come on now. There is a way to set the hex on this. Hang on one second. I want to make sure I'm doing this right. Let's see, boop. Oh, Well, look at that. How do we set color? Oh yeah, sure enough, just wants color. Let's see, new solid color brush. And I know we want to make a new color object. I know there's a way to feed this a hexadecimal value. Where? Oh, I see. You have to set the alpha. That's the opacity, by the way. You have to set the alpha, the blue, the green, and the red independently. Oh, I thought we could get away with something else. There is another way to do this, but since we're here, let's do. Let's fix this a little bit. And I'm going to say private on color equals new color, and then we will set the alpha equals 255, and oh gosh dang it, is this gonna let me do it, or do I? Okay, seriously, I've done this before. I know this works, but it's, oh, I can already see a problem. Okay, hang on. Let's do a control dot. It doesn't know what a color is. That makes sense. That makes sense. Well, there's a way to do that. Let's see. Hang on one second. Let me try this really fast. If I have a solid color brush like the on brush, and we do a set value, sets the value of a dependency property on a dependency object. No, that's not really what we want. Oh, look, it has a color property, which is nice. And then what does it want? It wants a color. Well, look at that. Can I make a new color? Because beforehand this has not been working. I know there's a way to do this. I've done this before. So it's a new color. Or do we say it's color dot? Oh, okay, there we go. Okay, so it's going to return a color object, and we want to set the alpha of this color to 255. Because everything is done in bytes, basically. And what's it saying? Cannot modify the return value because it is not a variable. Gets or sets the color of solid color brush. Gets or sets the color. Okay, hang on one second. I've done this before. I know it works. UWP hexadecimal color. Hex to color in C# for UWP. Color equals color convert from string. That just seems kind of roundabout. Drawing color translator to, oh geez, Meneses. Okay, well, sure. Why not? Seems weird, but I'll take it. Is there another way? Here is a byte, convert to UN32, blah, 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 blah. Solid color brush, my brush equals solid color brush, Windows color. From ARGB. Oh, okay. Yeah, all right. This is the way I've done it before, where we say color dot from ARGB. That's how I've done it. Okay, fine. So on the on brush, let's get rid of this other thing over here. We don't need it. We can do color dot from ARGB. Did it have something else? Did it have like a string? No, it didn't. Okay, just want to make sure. From ARGB, and it wants 4 values. The first value is going to be 255. The next value is going to be, let's go back to our Adobe page. And again, this is why I love this, right? Here's the red value. It's 225. So 225. The blue value is 114. And I'm sorry, that was the green value. And the blue value is 255. So red is 225, green is 114, and blue is 255. Awesome. In fact, if we want to see, oh no, we don't want to see it in action just yet. We will eventually. And then we want to have an off brush. And our off brush, we're also going to do, color from ARGB. And we want the alpha to be 255. That's the opacity. That's how solid the color is. If we went less than 255, then the color would actually be somewhat transparent to some degree. 0 is completely transparent. You can't even see the color. 255 is completely opaque, which means it's completely solid and you can't see through the color. And then if you had something like 125 or 170 or whatever, then you're about halfway. You're between how transparent it is. I couldn't think of the word for a second. How transparent the color is, right? All right, cool. So let's hop on over to Adobe again, and let's get the right color, freaking magenta. I think that's actually the name of the color. I think it's actually called freaking magenta. I think that's, and if it's not, then let's start a movement. All right, so let's see. That seems like a nice bright magenta. I like that. That's pretty good. It's a little deep. It's a little, okay, can we do something better? Let's just see. A little brighter, a little, that's the saturation we got to worry about, right? Let's go, that's not too bad. Let's do that color right there. And that means we're going to have red 255, no green, and 66 blue. Easy enough. So we're going to have all the red, no green, and 66 blue. Not a problem. Not a problem. In fact, if we want to take just a moment, and we want to make sure that these colors actually do what we want them to do, then we can hop on over here to the main page, and we can do this very quickly because we have Adobe Color handy. But let's go ahead and, you know what? Let's just uncomment our previous code, and it's going to be a pain here in just a second, but that's okay. Where it says fill, instead of blue, we can actually replace this with the hexadecimal value of that brush. We just have to prepend it with a hashtag symbol. And so you can see what purple it is over here. And the same thing is true if we go over to the pink. We can grab that hex value, copy it, and then replace the word orange with hashtag our pink color. And so now we've got off and we've got on, right? And, I think I want this to be a little bit more muted so it feels more off. So it feels more turned off, right? So I'm glad that we took a look at that. I'm glad that we took a moment and figured that out. And that means, let's see, it's not quite this color. Notice this color has changed now. So let me get back to where I was before with this color. So that is the color we had before. I want to bleed this thing out just a little bit. I want to make it kind of bland, but I also want to make it a little dark. There we go. That's like a sad grimace from McDonald's. If you don't know what grimace is, you're young. All right, cool. So let's come over here and let's change that to the new hex value. See, that looks more like a light off kind of thing. And this is rich. This is really rich. I kind of want to make it a brighter color. So let's come over here. Let's grab that. And let's get back to that color. And did that actually do what I wanted it to do? Did I get the, yeah, I did. Okay, cool. So that is the pink, but let's make it a brighter pink. Let's make it like something kind of, now we're getting into purple territory. What about this? This might impact our, that's like a tone. I want it to be like a vibrant pink. This is like a rich pink. So what can we do to make it vibrant? Well, that's actually a little bit better. That's a little bit better. Let's try that really quick and see what that looks like. It's not much of an adjustment, but sometimes a little is all you need. Yeah, that's not pink enough for me. I don't know why that's bothering me, but it is. Let's see. Where can I get a good, bright pink? Like freaking neon. Is there a neon around here somewhere? It's not over here, I'll tell you that. Let's see. That's not too shabby. That's actually really close to what I had before anyway. All right, fine. I'll acquiesce. Bam. That's still better than what we had. I do like it. All right, cool. So now we have our off color and we have our on color. And we've changed them, so we've got to go back and actually fix that over here. So let's make sure we get the right values. Hopping over here to the pink. The pink is 255.0138. So really the only thing that changes is that 66 becomes a 138. And then our purple, just make sure we have the right purple setup, because when you move in Adobe Color, because they're trying to set up a color palette, when you move one color, it moves all the colors in some way. So I'm going to come back over here, paste that in. And I hit the tab key, by the way. The reason this keeps jumping, I'm hitting the tab key so that it accepts my entry. And it's 135, 94, 153. Oh, that's interesting. 135, 153. 135, 94, 153. Uh, so let's come back over here, and it's 135, and then 94, and then 153. Sweet. All right. So we have our on brush, we have our off brush. Excellent. If we really wanted to, we could take a moment here. We could uncomment our code. You know, there's that part of me that wants to test this just to make sure everything works fine. So yeah, I'm going to uncomment this stuff for a second. All the way down to here. Uncomment. Control KU to uncomment. And let's hit these two right here. And let's uncomment those as well. Except now let's change this to off and on. And then this one will be on and off. For the purposes of this test, I really don't care if you swap this sequence. It doesn't really bother me. Okay, let's go ahead. Let's make sure that our display, yeah, everything's in place. Great. Let's go ahead and execute this thing and see what happens. Oh, everything exploded because I did something silly. Why are these all lowercase now? That's weird. Oh, I think it's because... Oh, control... I think I hit a button that accidentally lowercased everything. There's a hotkey for that, and I don't remember what it is. Because the fill is also lowercase. Oh, you know what? I don't even need this code. We're not even going to test that. I'm just going to comment that out again. But I want to fix it because I feel... Oh, everything got lowercase. Gosh, dang. What did I hit? I don't remember. Anyway, let's come back over here. And let's execute this code. So Control F5. It's going to run the application. Assuming that nothing breaks. Definition for rect... Oh. So we have these events right here. And I don't want you to lose that code. All right, fine. All right, fine. I'll fix everything. I hit some hotkey and it lowercased everything, and I got to manually fix it. And that's okay. That's okay. Not a big deal. Let's actually get this on the right line. R. You know, when I teach, especially, you know, I'm getting ready to teach new freshmen. And when I teach, all the time, I have students who are afraid. I just realized you can't see anything that's going on in my code. I just realized. I'm sorry, guys. Don't worry about it. I fixed it. Yeah. I have students all the time who are afraid to make mistakes because they've grown up in an educational environment where if you're wrong about anything, then you are automatically an outcast, you get mocked, you get teased. And so it's very punishing in public school settings, typically speaking, for people to be wrong about anything. And so I'm always telling my students, don't be afraid to be wrong. Get rid of your fear of being wrong. Because like I said earlier, you learn more from being wrong than from being right. It makes you better at everything that you do. You want to be right all the time, and I get that, but being wrong is extremely valuable. So, for example, earlier, my face was on the screen for a long time, and I didn't realize you couldn't see my code. All right, so just to make sure we're on the same page, I have restored some of the old code to make the compiler happy. And by the way, since you're here, Storm Chaser 1015, it's nice to have you on board. Thanks for being here, man. So we have the is flipped is back, and rect one fill is flipped. These two ternaries are back. And remember, we changed our brushes to on brush, off brush. So I made sure to update the names here as well to on brush, off brush. And then over here in the main page, we have the rectangles with their default states. In fact, this is the off brush. Yeah, so this should work the way I want it to. Okay, good. So let's go ahead and execute this application. And let's click the button, and they swap colors. So they're turning off and on. This is great. And the colors that we chose definitely have an on feel and an off feel. Okay, awesome. Now, let's see. We're almost out of time because I want to wrap this up about 5:30. And we're almost out of time. So let's see. What should we do? I'll tell you what. Let's go ahead and let's get our grid set up. And let's get some squares in place. Let's just get that far, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and go back through the pain of commenting everything out, which is actually not that bad. Just highlight all the stuff you don't need anymore. In fact, actually, I'm gonna start here, all the way down to here. Control KC to comment, and I'll collapse the region so I don't have to look at it. And now we're back to a good starting state. Control Shift S to save everything. So here we go. We don't need to be in the code behind just yet. Let's go to the designer. And by the way, you can also collapse commented code in the markup. It'll just collapse down to the root element of that code. All right, so I'm doing control. I've clicked into the designer, and I'm doing control scroll wheel to zoom in and out so that I can kind of get everything where I want it to be. Okay, good. Now, let's do the following. Let's go ahead and add a grid. Sorry, open tag grid. And with a grid is always at least one column, at least one row. And so what you see here is just one giant cell. And if I were to throw in a red rectangle just really fast, if all I did was do, here's a fill and it's a red, and that's all I said about the rectangle, it takes up the entire cell that it's given. So you can see that it's just one giant cell. And that's really adorable and all that, but we can do better. Inside of our grid, after our opening grid tag, and okay, let me try this again. Between our open and close grid tags, we want to add a new tag called grid dot. Let's start with columns. Column definitions. This is a special tag that represents a complex property on the grid object. You see, normally when you have a property that just takes in one value, just one thing, then you can have a property that's like an attribute. Like this rectangle has a fill property that allows us to add a color, because that fill will only ever be one thing at a time. It only has one object that it points to. But when you're talking about column definitions is actually a collection. So the value inside of column definitions is several objects, or could be several objects. And because of that, we can't just do this attribute syntax. We have to do what's called property element syntax. In other words, this property is its own tag, it's its own element. So we say grid dot so that we can indicate a property in the grid, and then we say which property we want, in this case, column definitions. And you're going to see why now. Let's start a new tag for column definition. One of the things I love about XAML and markup in this case is that every time we make a new tag, like a new grid tag or a new rectangle tag, really what we're doing is we're creating a new C# object, or a new instance of rectangle. So this creates a new grid object in C#. This creates a new rectangle object in C#, and this is a column definition object in C#. And column definitions, because they represent columns, allow you to set widths. I'm not too worried about width just yet. I'm just worried about the column being in place. So I'm going to go ahead and self-close that tag. And you don't really see a change here because it's always been one column. But if I then copy pasta, so I get two columns, you'll see that I now have two columns in my grid. And what else do you notice about these columns? If you look at them for a moment, you should notice very quickly, they're the same width. And in the designer, you'll see widths expressed above or beneath the objects. But what width do we have here? It's one star or one asterisk. And it even says it's star-sized. Do you see that? It says it's star-sized. What this means is that this is done by proportion. However wide this window is, we're going to give 1 star to the left and 1 star to the right. This width has been broken up into 2 equal units. And so 1 unit goes to the left, 1 unit goes to the right. If I were to run the application as it is right now, then when it comes up and I shrink the width, you'll see that the columns on both sides are changing widths as well, because they always remain proportionate, where this one gets 1 unit and this one gets the other unit. And if I wanted to, I could step in and I could say, okay, that's fine, but I can either give it, an explicit width. So this is 250 pixels, and this 1 star represents the remaining width. Or I could even say, well, let's do 5 stars on the left. And because I didn't indicate anything for the right side, we end up with 1 star, right? So now width has been broken up into 6 equal pieces, 5 of which go to the left and 1 of which goes to the right. I can come in here and I can say, well, that's cute and all, but this one's going to have 15 stars. So now the width is broken up into 20 parts, where 5 are on the left and 15 are on the right. So you can see that this is all about proportions, and you can use this to your advantage later in life. For right now, I really don't care about giving widths to the columns. So I just want to have 5 columns, right? So we're going to do copy pasta 3 more times. Now we've got 5 columns. Awesome. And if I want to make rows, it's the same concept. We're going to do grid.row definitions, where we are going to put a row definition object. And this functions exactly the same way. Let's put 5 of those. And this functions exactly the same way as column does, except columns are concerned with width, rows are concerned with height. In fact, pro tip, it is height. It is not height, because height is not a word. I don't know if you knew this or not, but I used to be an English major. Height is the word that we want. And so rows are concerned with height more than they're concerned with width. So now we've got 5 by 5, right? 5 by 5. Awesome. And, you know, I could go in here and I could manually populate each one of these. And I'll show you what that looks like just really quick. I'll show you what that looks like. You know, here we've got our red rectangle and it's in the upper left corner. If I were to copy pasta that and I were to change the second one to blue, what does it look like now? Where did the red rectangle go? Think about that for a second. So what really happened, that red rectangle is still there. Here, I'll prove it to you. Let me give the blue one a margin of 20 all around. Do you see how it now has a red border around it? In fact, you know what? Let's do 200. I basically eliminated the the blue. Let's make it 100. No, that doesn't work either. 75? Good enough. All right, so this blue rectangle now has a margin of 75 all around, and you can see the red rectangle underneath it. They're stacking on top of each other. If I change the order, if I put the red one first, the red one gets stacked on top of the blue, and now you can't see the blue anymore, right? All right, so I'm just going to back that off, do some undo with Control-Z, because Control-Z is my friend. All right, cool. So now we have 2 rectangles in the same spot, but what if I want this rectangle to be next to it? Well, this is in, if you're not familiar with computer science counting, there's something called zero-based counting. This is in column 0, the first column, and it's in row 0, the first row. If I want it to be over 1, it's going to be in row 0, but it's going to be in column 1. So all I have to do is inside of my blue rectangles markup, I can do grid.row, and that's going to be 0. And then I can do grid.column, and that's going to be 1. And now it's placed correctly. By the way, if ever your values are 0, you don't have to mention them. You can just get rid of them. And it's still in row 0. If I wanted this to be 2 rows down, then it needs to be in grid row 2. So now these are placed in the grid. Now you can see that since there are 25, I could do this. I could do copy pasta and just change, you know, somewhere between 45 and 50 values. It'd be 49 values to get these rectangles where they should be. But we are developers. We're not lazy, we're efficient. And this is not very efficient to do it this way. Plus, we don't really get our off brush either. You know, while we're here, let's give the grid a background color. Something mild, let's see what kind of grays they have. They have a light slate gray. Let's do that. See what, oh, that's kind of nice. I like that. It's probably complementary to our colors. Let's stick with that for right now. We can always change it later if we want. Let's hop over to our main page, XAML.cs, before we're out of time, and check this out. Oh, wait. First, because I know what we're going to be doing next, I'm going to give the grid a name. Remember earlier how we gave names to the rectangle and to the 2 rectangles, and then we gave a name to the button? The reason we do that is if I give it this name, this X colon name, the X colon, by the way, refers to this namespace. It looks like a URL, but that's actually a namespace. And it's saying that name, this thing that's defined as name, comes from the way it's defined in this namespace. And the reason we do this is because X colon name always works, whereas just regular name is actually circumstantial. It does not always work the way that we want it to. So I'm going to do X colon name, and when I give something a name, like if I call this main grid, actually I'm going to call it game grid. If I call this game grid, now that I've called it game grid here, and I save, I can go to the code behind, and I can now say game grid here, and now it knows it's referencing this grid object. So by putting a name here, I've tied it to the code behind here. And now that I've got game grid as a name, I can do game grid dot, and I can go into the properties of the grid. For example, I can talk to its row definitions, and I can get the count of the rows. And the reason I want that is because I want to store that in an int called rows so that I know how many rows this game grid has. Similarly, I want to make an int called calls, short for columns, and do game grid dot column definitions dot count. Awesome. And the reason I did that is because I want to tell the program how to fill this grid in without me having to manually place every single rectangle, right? So we are going to create two for loops, one on top of the other. So we're going to do for int row singular equals 0, semicolon. As long as row is less than the number of rows, and then when we modify, we'll do row plus plus. Go inside this loop, and when we're inside the loop, start another loop. Int call singular equals 0, and this is going to be the same kind of concept. Call is less than calls plural, and then call plus plus. Now we're inside here. In other words, it's going to, for every single row and for every column in that row, do this thing. So I'm going to make a new rectangle object. Now, this rectangle, it's easy for it to be seen in the markup because the markup knows what a rectangle is, but currently in the code behind it doesn't know what a rectangle is. Don't worry, we'll get there. I'm just going to call this rect, like get rect. And then we have new rectangle and semicolon. In order to fix our little squiggles, control dot, and then we want to use Windows UI XAML shapes. Now we have a brand new rectangle, and we want all of our rectangle fill, all of our rectangles at the beginning are going to start in the off position. So we want to have the off brush. Also, all of our rectangles, they need a little bit of margin. So we're going to make we're going to set a margin object which requires a thickness object. So we're going to make a new thickness, and let's just make it like 2 pixels all around, right? It's not that much. So now our rectangle has an explicit fill and it has an explicit margin. And you saw earlier that when I put a rectangle into a grid without giving the rectangle dimensions, it just filled the cell, it filled the space, right? And so the next thing we have to do is we have to talk to the grid class. Notice this isn't the main grid object. It's just the grid class in general. And we're going to call a method called setColumn. We're going to pass to it the rectangle itself, and we want to set what column it's in. Well, what column are we in? Whatever value this is currently, that's the column we want to put here. So we're going to put the column value. And then we're going to do the same thing again, except we want to do setRow. And we want to use the row variable. Hopefully now these two for loops are starting to make more sense as to why we're doing it this way. So now I've built a rectangle, I filled in its color, I gave it a little bit of margin so that not every rectangle is touching every other rectangle, and I told this specific rectangle where to be in the grid, but we haven't actually added it to the grid yet. This is where we're going to talk to our game grid, we're going to talk to its children, and we're going to tell its children collection to add the rectangle. Let's go ahead and execute this program and see what it looks like. It's not going to be perfect, but woof, that looks like the on brush to me, doesn't it? Doesn't it look like the on brush to you? Did I get that wrong? Oh my gosh. Wow. How did I not catch that? Okay, check this out, guys. There we go. Fixed it. I had put the off color in the on brush and the on color in the off brush. I'm so sorry. All right, no big deal. Let's go and run this again. There we go. Now they're all in the off position. Now they're all in the off position. Awesome. Okay, this is where we're going to stop for today. We have gone through, we've played around with events a little bit, and we have also added colors to rectangles. We've shown that if I click one rectangle, I can impact another rectangle. This is where we're going to stop for today with our default grid. We'll massage it. We'll make it look better a little bit later in life. But this is where we're going to end for today. I will, later in the week, between now and the next coding corner. I will get this put up onto a Git repo so that you can pull down the code for yourself and you can play around with it. I like to go through and add some commentary and make sure that the code is readable and that I haven't made any other silly mistakes that I've missed. So I'll polish the code, put it up on Git, and I will let you know when the next coding corner is going to be. It'll probably be next week, right about this time if we can, about 4 o'clock, and we'll carry it on from there. Thank you guys very much for being here. This video is going to be posted to YouTube as an archive so that you can watch this again later if you want, and you can do pause and fast forward and rewind, and you can see all the silly mistakes that I made, all that stuff. You guys are awesome. Thank you very much for being here, and until next time, remember, be epic, don't suck.